Good morning, and you're very welcome to this morning's Signpost webinar. My name is Pat Murphy, Head of Environment Knowledge Transfer with Teagasc. Our Signpost series is brought to you in conjunction with Dairy Sustainability Ireland, Food Drink Ireland, SkillNet, and the National Rural Network. This morning, we're delighted to welcome Professor Tommy Boland from the Department of Agriculture, our School of Agriculture and Food Science in UCD. Tommy, you're very welcome.
Thanks very much, Pat.
And to help us with the questions, we're joined by Catherine Keena. Catherine, again, you're very welcome.
Morning, Pat and Tommy.
Tommy, you'll be addressing us this morning on the multiple challenges of in achieving sustainable pasture-based livestock production systems. A broad topic.
A very broad topic, Pat, and maybe the title was a little bit ambitious when I set it, so I've maybe pared back a little bit from addressing the multiple challenges to a number of the challenges.
Okay. Yeah, there's no shortage. I suppose without further ado then, Tommy, if you were able to share your presentation, we'll proceed.
Thanks very much, Pat. So just sharing the slides there now, and you might let me know when they appear on your screen.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay, so Pat, thanks very much, and thanks to Yvonne and the team in Teagasc Signpost for giving me the opportunity to speak this morning. What I'm going to discuss is in around the topic of addressing the multiple challenges in achieving sustainable pasture-based livestock production. And I'm really going to represent some of the work that's taking place within the School of Agriculture and Food Science in University College Dublin. And the work is not all my own work. It represents a combined effort from my colleagues here listed, Helen Sheridan, Karina Pierce, Alan Kelly, Tomas Russell, and Liam McGrain, who works in AgTech UCD. If anybody's interested in hearing a little bit more about what we do in UCD, here are just some of the Twitter accounts, or you can contact me directly via my email address if there's questions which I don't address at the end of this morning's presentation. So just a very brief background. I'm sure many people on the call this morning are familiar with Lyons. UCD Lyons Farm is located just outside Dublin, just off the M7. It's the research and teaching facility, particularly supporting the undergraduate and the postgraduate activities in the School of Agriculture and Food Science and in the School of Veterinary Medicine. But I'm sure nobody will be too surprised to hear that the interest in the farm is increasing across the university over the last 4 or 5 years. There's about 250 hectares in the farm, and we cover all the main agricultural enterprises, including crops, including tillage, dairy, equine, sheep, and beef research. And more recently, we've also included the long-term pasture-based research platform, or the Lyons long-term grazing platform, on the farm. I understand that these slides are going to be shared with the attendees afterwards, so I've just included a quick link to a YouTube video which does give a little bit more insight and oversight into what we do at UCD Lyons Farm for anybody who's interested in looking at that. So there's a lot of conversation around sustainability, and sustainability can be a very complex term, and trying to get a good understanding of what it means. But I like this three-legged stool definition, and the three legs to sustainability being economic, social, and environmental. And probably quite a lot of the time we zone in, and certainly in my research work, I zone in on aspects of the environmental sustainability. But it is important to look at the economic and the social sustainability aspects of the whole sustainability piece. And that's what I'm going to start with this morning. And this week we saw the export, Board B export performance and prospects were announced on Wednesday. And it showed that Irish agri-food and drink exports, or Irish food and drink exports, had increased by 22% in year-on-year terms, up to a value of just under 17 billion. That equates to a daily food export of around 46 million euros worth of food products and drink products being exported from our country, which is, I think, quite an impressive level of performance. When we look at the major contributing factors to that 17 billion, or that almost 17 billion, we see that pasture-based activities are contributing a huge amount of that value. Almost 7 billion coming from the dairy sector, another 4 billion coming from meat and livestock, and then the consumer, or the prepared consumer food section, contributing another 3 billion. And again, many of our products produced in our pasture-based production systems will feed into that prepared consumer food section. So as an industry as a whole, as an agri-food industry, that's a very impressive level of performance. But we need to be very conscious as well of some of the challenges facing our exports and facing the value of the outputs which we're producing. If we look across the European Union and look at the inflation rate, up to November 2022 is running at just over 11%. Now, to put some context on that, the average inflation rate in the EU between 1997 and 2021 was 1.8%. So that's almost a tenfold increase in the rate of inflation across the European Union. And perhaps even more concerning, when we look at the contributing factors to that overall inflation rate, we can see that the inflation rate in food is about 70% higher than the inflation rate across all items. And there are reports just being released this morning which are showing that consumer preferences in terms of their protein purchases are starting to change across the European Union, with consumers starting to step back a little bit from red meats and placing more of a focus particularly on poultry or on the white meats in their protein purchasing decisions. This high inflation rate has led to a drop in consumer confidence, and the consumer confidence is running at historical lows across key economic regions, particularly across key markets into which we export our food products, whether that's the European Union or the OECD countries across Europe and the United Kingdom. And there's some suggestions that the UK has already tipped into recession, which is going to place pressure on our agri-food exports, of course. And then on the input cost side, facing the farming community, as we've witnessed over the last 12 to 18 months, and it's looking likely to continue for the next foreseeable future. We see key commodities have also increased in cost, particularly from a farming perspective and from a pasture-based farming perspective. We see fertilizer costs and energy costs demonstrating dramatic increases in prices. So while the export values are good, there are pressures coming on to I suppose, challenge profitability at individual farm level. The next aspect of sustainability I want to mention briefly is the whole social sustainability. And while we have at a national level a very well-performing agri-food industry, that agri-food industry and those export values I just referenced, they're built on tens of thousands of small individual building blocks, which are the Irish family farms and the men and women working around the country to produce those food products that contribute to our agri-food exports. Excuse me. My colleagues in UCD and elsewhere have been doing a lot of work looking at mental health in the farming community. And a headline figure from that research conducted by Tomas Russell and his colleagues is that almost 1 in 4 of Irish farmers are considered at risk for suicide. And that's a multiple higher than the general population. And there are various drivers behind this suicide risk. About 1 in 2 farmers experience moderate to extremely severe depression. About 45% of farmers experience moderate to extremely severe anxiety. And about 40% of farmers experience moderate to extremely severe stress. So these are really, really concerning factors for our farming population and the farming population which contribute to the success of our sector. And when these participants in the survey were asked from a list of 30 farming specific stressors, what caused them, I suppose, the most stress, or what were the main drivers behind these, I suppose, negative mental health outcomes. The 3 top stressors identified in that survey were government policies designed to reduce climate change, outsiders not understanding farming, and concern over the future of the farm. And they all really speak to sustainability in the broader context. So that's just trying to set the scene a little bit for some of the additional challenges which the sector is facing. And now I'm going to go on and talk a little bit more about the on-farm environmental sustainability aspects and challenges and what we can do to address those challenges. So that's where we're going to go to next with the environmental leg of the sustainability stool. something that came up at the UCD School of Agriculture and Food Science Research Symposium before Christmas was a term referred to as the carbon goggles, or having a focus on a single metric. And there's also this term of carbon tunnel vision. And I think it's really important because for the last, months and years, a lot of the conversation around the sustainability challenges for our sector has been in the area of greenhouse gas emissions and setting the sectorial targets. And I think it's really important that we don't lose sight of the other challenges, such as issues around biodiversity loss, air quality, water quality, and we're actually seeing action there in some of those other sectors, probably a little bit in advance of seeing action in carbon emissions when we're talking about policy instruments. And what I'm referring to there is the rebanding in the nitrates directive, for example, which is going to have knock-on impacts in production in this production year. So in our work at UCD Lyons Farm and within the School of Agriculture and Food Science, we try, insofar as possible, to be cognizant of these multiple challenges facing our pasture-based production systems. And I could have a dairy cow or a sheep at the center of this graphic just the same. It just so happens to be beef animals in this scenario. But in our work, we try to take long-term scenarios into consideration. So coming up with a solution that only works over the space of weeks or months is not really a solution. We need to have solutions in the longer term. And in any of our studies, we'll obviously be interested in animal performance. We're also interested in the pasture, biodiversity, soil health, water quality, emissions, profitability, and a whole wide range of other factors. So really what I'm trying to do is highlight the multidisciplinary nature of the challenge facing our sector, and also the multidisciplinary nature of the research ourselves in UCD and many other research organizations are undertaking at the moment to address these challenges. I'm sure everybody on the call is acutely familiar with these targets, so I'm not going to labor them, but we have challenges around carbon, around greenhouse gas emissions, around water quality, around biodiversity. I could have also put in here animal welfare, reducing pesticide usage, reducing availability of animal medicines, and so on and so forth. So there are a number of challenges facing the sector. And I suppose over the last decades, we've come through a period of really impressive, expansion in global food production and really impressive expansion in the value of our agri-food exports as a nation. But now we're faced with challenges in terms of the inputs we have been using to achieve that level of output and that level of output increase. And that's where the future research and where our current research at UCD is actually focused at the moment. In all this conversation around challenges, I think it's very easy to overlook, the benefits of pasture-based livestock production. We're located in a particular region of the world where the rainfall is fairly stable and fairly predictable. The growing season is pretty long, and we can produce large quantities of grass and forages. And we farm animals that can take these grasses, which contain nutrients unavailable for human consumption, and convert them into nutrient-dense, highly sought-after animal products, like that be meat or milk or any of their derivatives. And if we just take a kilo of lamb, and we could produce the same stats for a kilo of milk or a kilo of beef, we can see that at a systems level, a kilo of lamb converts around 27 kilograms of feed into that human edible product. Of that 27 kilograms, 26 kilograms is forage, which is otherwise unavailable directly for human consumption. And about 1 kilogram is comprised of concentrate feeds. And again, the vast majority of that concentrate feed stuff can be made up of feed ingredients that are not directly available for human consumption. I'm not saying it always is, but it can be made up of those feed ingredients not available for human consumption. And that's actually a really important contribution of ruminant livestock to global food supplies by opening up an area of land not otherwise available for food production through the use of those grazed forages. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of the work taking place now at UCD Lyons Farm. The first thing I'm going to talk about is our high output grass-based spring milk production system. And this is a project of work that's been ongoing for a number of years now. It's a collaboration between the School of Agriculture and Food Science and the School of Veterinary Medicine. And there are a number of people involved, but I suppose the overall programme is led by Karina Pierce from the School of Ag and Finbar Mulligan from the School of Veterinary Medicine. And we all know why grazing systems have developed. And a lot of the grazing systems have developed based on low output per cow with a view to maximizing stocking rate. That gives good cost control. You can avail of high stocking rates, and high profitability is impossible. Or sorry, high profitability is possible. Important correction there. High profitability is possible in those pasture-based lower output production systems. I suppose the reasons why we have gone for a grass-based system based on a higher output per cow are multiple. They range around environmental concerns due to increasing animal numbers, a limited availability of land or fragmented land resources for a number of farmers around the country, limited buildings and infrastructure, limited skilled labour available, and the potential for poor work-life balance in farm families through I suppose, very high cow numbers in individual herds. What is important to stress in terms of this high output or higher output system is that grass remains key and forage remains key in the feed budget. There's a lot of detail here on this slide, but basically what we're looking at is that the majority of the feed inputs across the year are coming from grazed grass and grass silage, with the target in our higher output production system to feed approximately 1.5 tonnes of concentrate on a fresh weight basis to cows each lactation. You will see, I suppose, at a national level is about a tonne of concentrates going into the average dairy cow in Ireland, and there would be other systems which would be promoting a lower level of concentrate input. But that's the system we have chosen in UCD. The herd targets then as follows. We have a stocking rate on the milking platform of 3.27 livestock units per hectare. The whole farm stocking rate is 2.33 livestock units per hectare. So it wouldn't be a very high whole farm stocking rate. A target milk yield per cow of between 7.5 and 8,000 kilograms. That would put us in the high banding in the nitrates perspective. A milk solids production per cow of 625 kilograms. I suppose for a long period of time, higher output cows would have been associated with poor fertility, but we're looking at a 6-week in-calf target rate of 75%. And as I said, a concentrate input of 1.5 tonnes per cow per lactation or per year. So they were the targets when we started out. What sort of a level is being achieved? We don't have the final data compiled for 2022 as of yet, but we're looking from 2016 across to 2021. We're achieving about 7,700 kilograms of milk yield per cow, and milk solids output per cow of 630 kilograms. So we're just on that kilogram of milk solids per kilogram of cow live weight ratio. And a milk solids output per hectare across the whole farm of just under 1,500 kilograms of milk solids output per hectare, which is, I think people can agree, it's a fairly respectable level of performance. But just to reiterate, this is not a system built on high levels of concentrate input. It's a higher level of concentrate input compared to the national average, moderately higher, I would suggest. But grass remains the key, I suppose, component in this production system. We're seeing 11 tonnes of grass dry matter utilised per hectare, another 1.5 tonnes of approximately of silage dry matter per hectare. This is achieved from a fertiliser input of 210 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare, 25 kilograms of phosphorus, 95 kilograms of potassium. We are, and work has been ongoing for a number of years by the team to increase the level of clover in the swards. We're achieving about 275, 280 days of grass, about 80 farm covers completed per year, and 9.7 grazings per paddock per year. So again, probably getting fairly close to a lot of those the grass 10 targets that people will be familiar with. And then if we look at the forage grown, we're somewhere between 13 and 14.5 tonnes of forage dry matter grown per hectare per year. The obvious year that stands out there on this graph is 2018. That's where we had quite a severe drought by Irish terms and by UCD Lyons terms. We are farming in one of the drier areas of the country. We would have an annual rainfall of about 750 millimetres. So it's quite a dry farm by Irish standards. And we do need pretty consistent rainfall to ensure we don't run into soil moisture deficits throughout the year. So that was very apparent in 2018. In terms, I suppose, of one of the key conversation points for the dairy sector at the moment is around nitrogen and nitrogen use efficiency. The farm and the systems herd does quite well from that regard. We're looking at a nitrogen utilization efficiency rate of just under 40% in 2021. Looking across the National Farm Survey, the national average is approximately 25.6%. I suppose this slightly higher level of nitrogen utilization efficiency is driven to a large extent by higher milk production per cow, reducing fertilizer usage again, that's improving with the increasing clover content in the sward. And then we've done a lot of work in the recent past on concentrate formulation, and particularly the concentrate protein percentage in the diets, which has probably fed through into the industry now at this stage as well. So I mentioned earlier that the key attribute of our pasture-based livestock production systems is their ability to utilize grazed grass. But for various reasons at various stages of the year, let it be grass supply or milk production requirements, there is a requirement to offer some level of concentrate supplementation. And regardless of whether that's a lower level or a higher level, there's still a requirement across most of our pasture-based dairy production systems for some level of concentrate supplementation of grass. The team in UCD, Keena, Pearson, Zoe, McCain, Finbar, Mulligan, have been looking at, I suppose, two broad areas in relation to what we can do to enhance the sustainability of this concentrate supplementation at pasture. Number one is around native feed ingredients. You know, we've high levels of feed imports into the country each year, and you know, they can be associated with increased carbon footprints. Now, let's not be naive. We don't have the current, or perhaps even at all the future, tillage production capacity to replace all this imported feedstuffs with native feedstuffs. But there certainly is scope to include more native feed ingredients in our feeding systems. Work has been conducted looking at barley, which can obviously be produced in the country compared to maize. And when our cows were offered alfalfa grass plus a barley-based concentrate, they produced more milk and a greater yield of milk solids per day compared to cows fed grass plus a maize-based concentrate. So it just shows the potential to have some positive impact on animal performance by inclusion of native ingredients. There was also work then comparing barley versus oats, and you know, anybody who can remember back far enough will know that oats was once a very important part of the Irish agri sector and is increasing in importance again, I would suggest. And the cows fed an oat-based concentrate, they had a higher fat concentration in milk, and it was higher in unsaturated fatty acids, or the good fats present in that milk. And that also resulted in milk that was more suitable for processing. So again, we're seeing some benefits of inclusion of oats in the diet for our dairy cows. Perhaps a more topical area then as well is looking, our work has been done to reduce the crude protein content in the diet of the dairy cow. We all know, or we all should know, that grass and grazed grass and grass plus clover swards or grass swards receiving very high levels of fertilizer nitrogen application will have a high crude protein content. And there's probably limited value in feeding high crude protein concentrates to supplement or to support that grass diet. So some of the work the team has conducted has looked at reducing the crude protein content in the diet, in the concentrate proportion of the diet, from 18% down to 14%. And the results would show that when that work was undertaken, there was no negative impact on milk yield or no negative impact on milk solids production across the main grazing season. Then I suppose the boundaries are pushed a little bit further in terms of going from a 14% concentrate down to a 12% concentrate. And again, one of those 12% concentrates contained non-native ingredients, the other contained native ingredients. And while we did see a numerical decline in milk yield of about 1.3 to 1.4 kilograms of milk yield per day, there was no significant difference in the fat and protein yield or the milk solids yield achieved by those cows. I think they're important results. Usually when we conduct research, we want to see differences between treatments. In this case, I think the desire was that you wouldn't see a difference between milk production when you were reducing the protein content. What we do know, however, is that by reducing the quantity of protein consumed by our dairy cows, that we will reduce the quantity or the amount of nitrogen excreted by our dairy cows onto pasture, because there's an almost straight line relationship between nitrogen consumed and nitrogen excreted in our ruminant livestock. So there's a win here in terms of reducing the quantity of nitrogen being excreted onto the pasture. So I'll park the dairy cow there for the moment, and I'll move on to the other area where we've been researching for the last 10 or 12 years at Lyons Farm. And we're not the only ones conducting research in this area. John Finn has been working in this area for a number of years, and more recently colleagues in Grange and Moore Park and Athenry have become involved as well. But Helen Sheridan has been leading this research program in UCD for 12 or 14 years now at this stage, and I'm lucky to be involved, and Bridget Lynch was centrally involved when she was in UCD, and many others as well. So multi-species swards are receiving a huge amount of attention at the moment, I think. And what we consider a multi-species sward in Ireland is really built on a 6-species mixture. That 6-species mixture contains perennial ryegrass and timothy, white clover, red clover, chicory, and plantain. And each of those species, or each of those functional groups, if we take grass as a functional group, legumes and herbs as a functional group, each of those functional groups and each of those species are included there for a particular purpose. But one of the big benefits of having a multi-species sward, and it's demonstrated nicely, I think, in this graphic produced by Shona Baker, is the different rooting depths achieved by the different plants in the mixture. So that allows the different plants to avail of nutrients at different, I suppose, sward soil horizons. And also particularly in periods of low rainfall, these deeper rooting plants can draw up moisture from deeper in the soil horizon, which will allow them to be more resilient to drought. And there's lots of work from Ireland and elsewhere to show that to be the case. But I suppose our work, or my proportion of the work in particular, is interested in looking at how animals perform when they're fed these multi-species swards. And for animals to perform, we need to grow herbage. So we've been running a beef system study with Hereford steers from the dairy herd now since 2018. We have 3 sward types. We have a ryegrass monoculture, a ryegrass white clover system, and a multi-species sward system containing those 6 species I just made reference to. The major difference between the 3 systems, in addition to their plant makeup, is the fact that the perennial ryegrass sward receives 205 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year, and the other 2 swards receive 115 kilograms, or sorry, the other 2 swards receive 90 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year. And what we've seen with our multi-species swards, they're capable of producing an extra 2.5 ton of forage dry matter per hectare compared to the perennial ryegrass only swards. We feed those swards to our animals. So we have 3 herds of cattle of Hereford steers grazing those swards. They start grazing at about 15 weeks of age, and they're carried through until slaughter at around 20 months. When they're housed, they're fed silage made from their respective treatments. So cattle which graze perennial ryegrass during the summer will receive perennial ryegrass silage during the winter, and so on. Compared to the perennial ryegrass animals grazing either the white clover or the multi-species swards are reaching slaughter about 4 to 5 weeks earlier than their perennial ryegrass counterparts. So we're reducing the period of finish for those animals, which is quite important, and we'll see in a moment from a carbon and an economic perspective. To mention carbon footprint, and carbon output, which is really important, when we look at the carbon footprint per kilogram of beef, live weight, and exactly the same statistics show up per kilogram of beef carcass produced, we're seeing that compared to a perennial ryegrass animals, the animals grazing either the ryegrass plus white clover or the multi-species sward have a 15% lower carbon footprint. And this has been driven by 2 factors. It's been driven by the reduced nitrogen fertilizer application rates, hence reduced nitrous oxide emission in the system. And it's also been contributed to by the fact that those animals are being finished earlier. Obviously, those 30 or 35 days are coming off the end of the animal's life, and that's the period when the animal will produce its largest quantity of methane emissions. We are doing work at the moment to see if there is any, I suppose, impact of the multi-species swards on the daily methane emissions from the individual animals. And that may further add some benefits to the multi-species system in terms of the carbon footprinting perspective. The bottom line is important in all these interventions. And I think anytime we're looking at enhancing environmental sustainability, we also need to be conscious of the economic impact of those interventions. What we have seen with our ryegrass and white clover and our multi-species systems is an almost 70% increase in net margin compared to the perennial ryegrass only system. And the perennial ryegrass profitability was not poor in this study. Why is this difference occurring? Again, it's coming from the reduced fertilizer nitrogen input and the reduced level of concentrate feeding. And I suppose these figures were calculated in February, March of 2022. So they include the costs incurred in 2020 and 2021. They don't include 2022 costs, which are substantially higher than what we saw in 2021. I displayed that graphic earlier on, looking at the multiple, I suppose, areas we're looking at, and we're also doing a lot of environmental measurements and biodiversity measurements and water quality measurements. Just to quickly make reference to one, when we looked at the earthworm populations and the earthworm activity in our multi-species swards, we see that where the swards contain legumes in particular, but mixtures in general, would show much higher earthworm populations and much higher earthworm activities. And particularly when we measure earthworm activity as on the basis of earthworm casts, Olaf Schmidt and his team in UCD and Helen Sheridan would have shown that we get better rates of water infiltration into the soils on which multi-species swards and legume-containing swards are growing. So what does this mean? Well, it reduces the risk of surface runoff, and it reduces the rapid transfer of rainfall into streams and into waterways, which has the potential, if adopted at a wider scale, to reduce flood risk across catchments. So again, a very important, and it's one of a number of environmental benefits we've been recording with the multi-species swards. There are challenges as well with multi-species swards, which I'll be happy to discuss in the questions and answer section. So that's some of the work we have done to date. Let's look at very briefly at some of the work coming up in the future. Zoe McKay and Keen Minogue is the PhD student working in this, and working with Michael Deneen in Teagasc Moor Park on a pasture nitrogen utilization efficiency program. And particularly here, our focus is around the usage of plantain. And plantain is a herb that's been getting more attention in recent years. We've probably all seen it in hedgerows and even probably most commonly on waste ground around the country. And for years, I suppose our swards have been dominated by ryegrass. More recently, a little bit of work on ryegrass and white clover, a lot of work on ryegrass and white clover, and a little bit of work on multi-species swards. But work in New Zealand has placed a particular focus on plantain. And plantain is a herb with a deep taproot. It produces a number of secondary compounds which can influence what happens in the animal. They can also influence what happens in the soil. And there's work from New Zealand, as I said, to show that reduced urinary nitrogen excretion is actually occurring in cows which are being fed plantain. So that's what we're going to look at in Lyons. Can we reproduce those results in an Irish context? And if so, it has a potential to offer, I suppose, to offer a solution to some of our nitrogen challenges. Given the fact that we feed 1.5 tons of concentrates to our dairy cows each year as well, we also have the opportunity to look at concentrate supplementation strategies. In addition to reducing the protein content, are there other ingredients we can utilize which will allow us to reduce the concentrate input, and reduce the nitrogen excretion from our dairy cows? So that's work that's going to take place in 2023. The last piece of work that's ongoing is the use of, I suppose, novel delivery methods to feed additives, or to deliver additives to our dairy cows and our beef cattle and our pasture-based livestock. And a piece of work Stafford Vigers and myself and Zoe are doing with Terra Nutritech, BioAtlantis and Moonsys is looking at, can we feed novel seaweed extracts through the water stream, or deliver novel seaweed extracts through the piped water system to our cows at pasture for animals which are not receiving as much or any concentrate supplementation compared to the dairy cow at Lyons. And we're starting to see some really promising and really exciting initial results from this approach. So it'll open up potentially a wider application of feed additives across the entire industry. A lot of this work, I suppose, is being facilitated and being supported by the fact that in UCD we have a very close relationship with the ag industry as a whole. And Liam McGreen and Niamh Collins and their team in the UCD Ag Tech Centre are focused now on promoting and accelerating startups in Ireland and beyond. And we're currently seeing the construction of the Ag Tech Centre at UCD Lyons Farm. And over the last 2 years, there's been the Accelerator campaign taking place, where startups have been invited in for an intensive training program, and also their facilities, their technologies have been tested at UCD Lyons Farm using the facilities available to us. And this is one of the main assets of the AgTech Research Centre, the fact that it's based on the farm and it can access the resources of the farm to support ag innovation, to allow us to address the sustainability challenges. So Pat, I'm not sure how I'm doing for time, but I'm going to finish up there, and hopefully that's just giving a quick overview of some of what we're doing in terms of addressing the challenges facing pasture-based production.
Okay, that was a whirlwind, and thank you for that. Could I remind people that if they have questions, to use the questions and answers to put the questions to you. I suppose just a few things just to start. You outlined a number of areas of promise into the future, and I suppose the multi-species sward one is one where there's been a lot of conversations going on. But how close do you think we are to concluding that this is the way forward for pastures in Ireland into the future?
Yeah, I think we're still a step away from that, Pat, to be very honest with you. I think the multi-species swards have demonstrated huge potential, and I'd be confident in making a few statements around them now. In terms of feeding them to beef cattle or to sheep, if we feed multi-species swards to beef cattle or sheep, it'll increase their level of performance, their level of average daily gain, and reduce their period to slaughter. And we've multiple studies from Ireland and elsewhere to show that. The work on the dairy cow is probably less advanced than it has been with the beef or the sheep animal, so that work is still ongoing. It's never going to be a solution for every farmer in Ireland, just like no technology is going to be a solution for every farmer in Ireland. So I would view multi-species swards like a feed additive, or like many of the other technologies, as another tool in the toolbox. And I would also, I suppose, make the point that we've decades and decades of research gone into perennial ryegrass and perennial ryegrass white clover more recently, the last couple of decades. And there's still a huge number of research questions to be asked of those swards, and we continue, and your colleagues in Moorpark and Johnstown and elsewhere continue to ask those questions. We've really been just working with multi-species swards for a very short period of time relative to that. So there's lots of questions still to be asked. The main questions I would see at this stage are, what's the best establishment technique? What can we do around the persistency? Because a herb like chicory in particular, or plantain, they do not persist in a sward to the same extent that a grass plant will persist in the sward. So we have a couple of decisions to make there. Do we view those plants as being important in our mixture? And we believe they are. Then how do we keep those plants in the sward? Or maybe more accurately, how do we bring them back into the sward after they disappear? And that's not a full reseed. That cannot be a full reseed for all sorts of reasons. And there are questions around weeds in multi-species swards. Almost all of our work would show that there is not a weed issue with a multi-species sward. We actually have lower weed ingress. Now, if you have an absolutely filthy paddock before you sow multi-species swards, most likely you're going to have a very, very dirty paddock after you sow multi-species swards. If that happens, you have no herbicide approach to take. And then the final comment I'll just make on the multi-species swards there, Pat, and I could talk about them all day, but I'm sure nobody wants to listen to me, is our work on multi-species swards has really focused on a 6-species mixture. 2 grasses, 2 legumes, and 2 herbs. And we've been looking at comparing that to an intensively managed perennial ryegrass monoculture or a ryegrass plus white clover sward. A multi-species sward could cover anything from 4 to 40 species. So as a term, it's almost, or it can be meaningless because it describes so much that it actually doesn't describe anything So I should probably restart referring to our multi-species ward as a 6-species mixture rather than a multi-species ward, just to clarify that fact.
Okay. I wouldn't mind taking you back right to the beginning of your presentation, where you talked about the mental health issue of farmers, and I think there's a lot of work out there also on the more physical health side of farming, of farmers as well. I mean, what you presented there was highly worrying, and I'm just wondering, I think the question of are we doing enough in this space is probably pretty obvious. I don't think we are, but what can be done to try and address this a huge problem as I see it?
Yeah, it's a huge problem, and the answer to that question, Pat, is really far beyond my range of expertise. But you know, my colleagues Tomas Russell and his team in UC, they're doing a lot of work in that, and really what they're trying to do now is to attract more funding to further interrogate what's happening at farm level, and as you said rightly, try to come up with some solutions. And we can get caught up in headlines quite often, I think, in 17 billion euros worth of exports, or a greenhouse gas reduction target of 25% by 2030. But for any of those headlines to be achieved or to materialize, it is dependent on the 120 or 130,000 farms and farming families around the country that are supporting those activities, or that are required to make changes to meet those targets. And in addition to 120 or 30,000 farms, there are 120 or 30,000 farm families involved there. And if the farmer, let it be the husband or the wife or the mother or the father, if they're not farming that land, most likely somebody else will. But if they're not parenting those children, then there is nobody else to fulfill that role. So it's really important in terms of the farm or the family structure and those individuals that we can address those mental health challenges and indeed the physical health challenges.
Okay, Catherine, questions starting to fly in?
Yeah, question coming in. And first of all, Tommy, I'd just like to say I loved and welcomed the broad focus on sustainability in your presentation. I think it's really good. Questions, what role do universities have in getting knowledge to farmers when they don't have a direct knowledge transfer department themselves?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Catherine. I think we're probably having more and more one-to-one interaction or group interaction with farmers than we would have had before, and particularly some of the developments that have taken place at Lyons Research Farm in the last decade or so. The Dairy Education and Research Centre and the long-term grazing platform has attracted a lot of attention and interest from farmers. So we get farmer groups coming in, but we're a small group of people working in that area, and you can only accommodate so many individual groups before it becomes quite onerous and takes over your life, really. Our real avenue for outreach is through the education of undergraduates in both the agri-science sector and the veterinary medicine sector. So these are people who are going to enter the industry and interact with farmers on a daily basis, whether as an ag scientist or a vet. And that's the avenue we're taking. We're bringing this latest research into our educational programs, our undergraduate and our postgraduate programs, and trying to equip our students and our graduates with the most up-to-date information. And then the graduates take that out to the sector.
Very good. Just one question. You use the term native feed ingredient. Now, myself as a biodiversity person, native plant species have probably a very different connotation, plants that have been growing wild for 10,000 years. And maybe it's a familiar term now that I hadn't heard before, but are you talking about homegrown or Irish or?
Yeah, I suppose grown in the country, Catherine, is what we're referring to there. So produced on tillage farms in Ireland.
Yeah, okay. Just
I take your point on native.
Yeah, from a biodiversity angle. Yeah. Do you have an opinion on how maize silage compares to maize concentrate as a supplement to cows at grass? This is in connection with the slide on barley and oats.
Yeah, it's not a question we've looked at directly, but what I would say when you're comparing any feed ingredients is that you need to compare them on a nutrient basis, let that be protein, energy, minerals, fatty acids, etc. So the diet needs to be balanced for those essential nutrients. If you look at maize silage compared to maize grain, maize silage obviously contains a lot more fiber because it includes the entire plant, whereas maize grain is obviously just a starch containing grain. So it'll have a lower energy density, probably a slightly higher protein content, but a much higher fiber content. So you just need to be cautious and have your nutritionist balance that diet correctly.
It's well established that clover and multi-species swards have advantages over perennial ryegrass only, but does a multi-species sward have a significant advantage over clover?
Yeah, it's a good question. When we look at some of our performance statistics, we would see that the white clover, I'm talking about beef cattle here, with the white clover containing sward will be quite close to the multi-species sward in terms of animal performance. We still see the multi-species sward doing a little bit better. It has a slightly, the multi-species animals are finished slightly quicker than the perennial ryegrass white clover animals. We did see, and we have seen to date on our studies, a higher herbage production with our multi-species swards compared to our ryegrass white clover swards. Now, it's really important to say in any of these comparisons, the ability of a ryegrass white clover sward to grow depends on the clover content in the sward. So if you compare a ryegrass white clover sward that has a low clover content to anything, it will be disadvantaged in that comparison. And what we have seen with our multi-species swards today, Catherine, is that the red clover is actually making a really big contribution to both the herbage production and, we believe, the nitrogen fixation capacity. So we always need to be really, really careful about making sweeping statements to saying a multi-species sward is better than a ryegrass and a white clover sward, because it's very much dependent on what the makeup is.
Tommy,
Sorry, go on, Pat.
Yeah, just going back to, I suppose, some of the multiple benefits of the multi-species sward, and you mentioned, I suppose, that the lower production of nitrates, and I suppose there's a number of factors, and there's some research coming from New Zealand. Am I right in thinking that some of the places where you have multi-species sward, you've put in an intensive infrastructure to look at that nitrate issue?
Yeah, that's correct. So on that long-term grazing platform I mentioned, we have 12 fields or 12 paddocks in that pat. Each paddock is 2 hectares, but each 2 hectares is fully drained, or we call it hydrologically isolated, because as researchers, you like to make things sound more complicated than they actually are. But that allows us to measure all the water that's drained from those sites, and also, most importantly, measure the nutrient content carried in that water. So nitrates, phosphates, particulate matter, even the microbial populations of those soils. So it's something that we are going to be looking at in much more detail in the coming years.
Okay, that should be interesting.
Yeah, we're looking forward to it.
Back to, how do multi-species swards fare if they are cut and ensiled as round bales?
It's I'll temper the comments I'm going to make on that, because I'm being recorded and there's 380 people on the call. Probably the best silage and the worst silage I have been involved in making at UCD Lyons Farm have come from multi-species swards. They do take longer to dry, because generally the multi-species sward has a higher moisture content. So the best time to make multi-species sward silage is in the main grazing season, the main silage season, so May, June time, when you have good drying conditions. We did make some multi-species sward silage in late August, early September one year, and it just wasn't dry enough. And I suppose the big issue with that was the bale integrity. They were so wet, the bales didn't retain their shape. That was once off. Our more common experience with multi-species swards is when we make that multi-species sward silage and we feed it to our cattle. The calves, so this is from our beef system again, Catherine, those calves going into the shed at 7-8 months of age for their first winter, the calves getting the multi-species silage are growing 200 grams per day faster than the calves getting the perennial ryegrass silage. So you can make really, really good quality silage with a really high feeding value from that multi-species silage. Thomas Maloney did a PhD in grains with Padraig O'Kiley a few years back, and again, Thomas's work would support that. When the sward is dried, you can make very good quality silage from multi-species swards.
Okay.
And
sorry, Pat.
Sorry, yeah, I suppose just a divergent question, and there's a question there. Is there an argument for lifelong learning access or improved lifelong learning access for farmers, as there is in other areas of work, and are we doing a good enough job there in terms of providing that to farmers?
Well, I think that there's probably lifelong learning required for us all, Pat, whether you're a farmer or a farm advisor or a researcher or anything else. And I think yourself and your colleagues in Teagasc do a very good job in terms of providing that lifelong learning for Teagasc clients. But so yes, there is a requirement. but I think that there's so many competing interests for farmers' times and competing activities for advisors as well, particularly around the schemes and the huge labour requirement involved in scheme compliance, that absolutely there is requirement for continuing education and continuing personal and professional development for farmers, just like any profession. But there is a lot of thought required, I think, as to how best to deliver that. And I know probably yourself and your colleagues in Teagasc spend a lot of time thinking and actioning on that very question.
Catherine?
Yeah, any work on pasture-fed pork, effect on soil health?
I cover a broad range, but I haven't got the pasture-fed pork yet, Catherine.
That's okay. What would be the transition time from ryegrass to multi-sward? Not sure.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I suppose it really depends on what capacity farms have for reseeding. So if you're looking at a 10% reseeding rate, and if every paddock on the farm was to be converted to multi-species swards, then you're looking at a 10-year transition. But it's important to understand in that as well, that the paddock you receive today, in 10 years' time, unless that gets some additional attention, at least from our experience, it won't still be the same multi-species sward you've sown today in 10 years' time. We've had, again, swards running for 3 years, and we've seen the herb content diminish to a level which we weren't happy with, and we've come back in and rejuvenated those swards.
Okay, so that covers queries about how long they last. Another question there: have you plans to investigate reductions in methane production due to increased multi-species swards feed?
Yes, we have. We're doing that at the moment with the cows fed silage indoors. So the multi-species sward silage versus the ryegrass silage, we have these green feed machines in place investigating methane emissions, and we're just analysing the data from the grazing study that took place in August and September in 2022. So in the next few weeks, we should have the numbers on the first round of methane emissions from those cattle.
Pat, you come in if I'm missing any. I'm just going down through them there. But Tommy, great presentation. I was on a talk recently about Trevor Gilliland, and he's of the opinion that cocksfoot is more suitable than Timothy in dry ground, and we should have separate advice for different soil types. What are your thoughts?
I'd certainly agree we should have separate advice for different soil types, and I kind of made reference to that earlier, that a one size doesn't fit all here. And I also made reference to the fact that Lyons is a very dry farm. So what happens in Lyons won't necessarily be replicated on a farm which has a higher rainfall. The reason why we've gone with Timothy, we did have swards previously with cocksfoot. The reason why we've gone with Timothy is Timothy can achieve actually quite a good level of ground cover very, very early in the establishment of the sward, and we were using that as a tool to, I suppose, outcompete some of the weeds which may appear in the sward.
Tommy, you mentioned there drought, and I suppose we've had a very good experiment over the last 5 seasons of drought with 2 severe droughts and a few minor droughts. How have your multi-species compared in their productive capability with, I suppose, both grass clover and perennial ryegrass?
Yeah, so I suppose the first thing I'll say, Pat, is the soil will eventually run out of water. So it doesn't matter what you grow, it'll eventually deplete the water reserves in the soil, or the evapotranspiration will eventually get rid of the water from the soil. So there's no, at least not that I'm aware of, I'm very slow to make definitive statements anymore because somebody will always pick me up on it, but there's no plant that will grow continuously without water that I'm aware of yet. We were seeing during the drought periods that during the periods of soil moisture deficit, we were seeing 2 to 3 times the growth rate on the multi-species swards compared to the perennial ryegrass and the perennial ryegrass white clover swards. The perennial ryegrass white clover swards were holding up a little bit longer than the perennial ryegrass in those drought or those low rainfall conditions, but not nearly to the same extent as the multi-species swards. And from a plant morphology perspective, that makes sense because you have things like chicory and red clover and plantain, which are sending roots down deeper into the sward, into the soil horizon to draw up that moisture.
And I suppose a follow-on question on that, in terms of, I suppose, management and establishment and keeping, I mean, it's becoming well established that if you want to include clover, your soil fertility has to be very high. Is it fair that we assume the same principle for a multi-species sward?
Yeah, I think that's a fair starting point, Pat. It certainly doesn't want to be any lower than it is for a perennial ryegrass monoculture. So things like legumes, they like the higher pH, and the earthworm populations in the soil as well also like that slightly higher pH. So yes, you're looking at we would follow kind of the standard recommendations for a ryegrass clover sward when establishing our multi-species swards.
Sorry,
yeah, go on ahead.
I'll just run through a few quickly. There's a good few coming in there, Pat, and you pick up any important ones there towards the end. Are the emissions from the more regular reseeding associated with multi-species swards versus perennial ryegrass taken into account when comparing emissions reductions?
So what we had done in that modelling exercise, we'd modelled exactly what we did on the farm. So all the farm was 100% reseeded at the beginning. We had built in twice the frequency of reseeding into the multi-species sward as the perennial ryegrass sward as well. But yeah, that viewer is exactly right. If we're reseeding more frequently in terms of a full plough-till sow type method, then you're going to be emitting a lot of carbon from that soil, and that's not where we're looking at in terms of the rejuvenation of our swards.
A specific question there about your trial showed multi-species out yielding perennial ryegrass, but the yield for perennial ryegrass is only 10 tonnes in your trial, and perennial ryegrass can yield more. Any comment?
Yeah, absolutely. Perennial ryegrass can yield more, and we would see on our grazing dairy platform as well. We're probably getting 13.5 tonnes of ryegrass from a slightly higher fertilizer input, but certainly you wouldn't expect an extra 2.5 tonne from the additional quantity of fertilizers going on to our main grazing platform. Bear in mind that these swards have been grazed in a beef system, so you're not getting daily shifts and daily allocations of grass like you would in a dairy system. But I think it's fair to say, and anybody who has visited the site, we have been slightly disappointed with the grass yields we're achieving on our fertilizer, on our perennial ryegrass sward. We have had other studies with comparing ryegrass to multi-species swards where we've been getting higher yields of both multi-species swards and perennial ryegrass than we achieved on this particular site. I suppose one quick comment on the site, Catherine. Prior to UCD purchasing this site, it had been in continuous tillage for about 30 years. So we're working off very low soil organic matter content and I suppose a somewhat depleted soil in that regard.
Okay, just a last quick question, and then I'll go back to Pat. Are the seeds easy to come by?
Yeah, they're much more accessible now than they were 5 years ago. Yeah. And the main seed suppliers will all have multi-species mixtures.
Tommy, I suppose what you're showing us in throughout your discussion today is I suppose a heavy shift in your focus towards sustainability. Is that something that across UCD and the university sector as a whole, is it becoming a very big issue in, I suppose, both research and the training and education that you provide?
Yeah, I think that's a fair comment, Pat. We recently had kind of a somewhat of an internal review of kind of the mission of the university and the key approaches the university is going to take. And I think it's quite a statement by the university that they made the decision to appoint a vice president for sustainability. So that's at a university-wide level. At a school level, at a college level, at a farm level. I think it's fair to say that we've always had quite a strong focus on sustainability in terms of our research and in terms of our teaching. And I go back to my time as an undergraduate student here when Frank O'Mara was lecturing me in animal nutrition, and Frank was talking about nitrogen excretion and reducing methane emissions from beef cattle and dairy cattle at that stage, and that has continued ever since. As indicated by only a subset of the work I've shown this morning. There's similar colleagues doing similar work across forestry, across tillage, etc. I think what's happening more now is that that's been more overtly labelled in terms of sustainability and sustainable agriculture. For a long time, we were incorporating it into agriculture. And sometimes I'm maybe a little bit uncomfortable with that particular description of sustainable agriculture, because a lot of what we're talking about here is a lot of good practice that farmers are already engaged in.
Okay, I think on that note, time has caught up with us. We're going to have to leave it there. A huge amount of appreciation, I think, coming through in the comments for the presentation you've given. And I won't allude to them specifically, but I think a very high quality presentation, and thanks for that, Tommy. Next week, we're going to be joined by Dr. Finbar O'Regan and Ted Massey from the Department of Agriculture. The original billing of this was to deal with the fertilizer register, but the fertilizer register is not going to come out as early as we thought. It was due to be established right from the beginning of the year, but there are some delays in that. So there's a broadening of that topic to cover the fertilizer database and the issue of banding of dairy cows and other recent changes in the Nitrates Action Programme. So that should be of interest to most of you, I think. So until next week, I'd like to thank Yvonne Marr and Andy Boland as our series producers, and say to you to enjoy your weekend, and hopefully we'll see you again next week. And thanks again to Catherine as well.
Thank you. Bye-bye.